Well, hello there, and welcome to another edition of Warbird Wednesday. My name is Fred Bell, the Vice Chairman of the Palm Springs Air Museum, and today I am standing in front of probably one could call the Queen of Battle in the Pacific, and a real game changer when it comes to naval warfare at that time in World War II. So I am standing in front of the F6F, the Hellcat. And the Hellcat, you can tell by my cap here today that Greg picked out for me, Grumman was cooking up a whole lot of whoop-ass for the Japanese in World War II with this airplane. Can I use that term? I probably can use that term. What the heck? They were cooking up a whole bunch of trouble for the Japanese in World War II. We're going to get into that. And I'm going to take off my chef's hat today. Oh, that was exciting. And I'm going to toss this one, has no weight. There we go. Greg got it again. Of course, I am with and I'm looking over here, my imperturbable, dude, it's like my good Dr. Evil. I got Greg to laugh on that one. Imperturbable assistant, Greg Kenny today, who is, of course, my sidekick here at the Palm Springs Air Museum. Now, the F6F, the history, we're going to go through this pretty quick because we've done the P-40, we've done the Wildcat, which is ironically sitting right next to this airplane. Greg can get a shot of that at some point. But we're going to go through this fairly quickly today, at least on the genesis of how we got here. Remember, the Japanese assumed at the early start of the war at Pearl Harbor that the battleship was still the queen of battle. In other words, and the idea behind battleships was you got up into a line and you shot at each other, and whoever had the most ships still floating at the end of the battle won the battle. Well, there's a tactician that said you never fight the last war, right? The Japanese had correctly surmised that air power in the Pacific, because remember, you got all that water out there, right? Not a lot of land bases. And if you're going to fight a war in the Pacific, you had to have fast attack, these carrier groups that would provide air cover and aerial bombardment for all these islands that you're going to attack, because it wasn't a land war, and that was the only way that you could get air cover over the target in order to be able to successfully invade. They called it right. The Japanese looked at what the British accomplished against the Italian fleet in the harbor at Taranto, where they destroyed most of it with aerial torpedoes. With, by the way, Greg, remember we talked about the Stearman biplane? They were using Swordfish torpedo bombers at that time, which was pretty much an outdated airplane, against that Italian fleet, and they scored great success. Once the Japanese made the decision to go to war, they knew that the American Pacific Fleet was probably the largest, the most well-equipped, and the most dangerous weapon in the Pacific to stop their expansion. So they came up with an attack plan. Now, the interesting thing, Greg, is I'm going to talk about later in this somebody who was involved in that attack on Pearl Harbor, and they went all the way through the war, and they popped up somebody else, somewhere else. I'm going to talk about that. But the Japanese attacked, as we know, the American fleet at Pearl Harbor, inflicted heavy damage. Now, they made one tactical error, and it would come back to haunt them later in the war, and that was the American carriers were not at Pearl Harbor at the time. They correctly surmised they destroyed the core of the American battle fleet, which was those battleships, but they were unable to get the aircraft carriers. Now, it's debatable in history, and you can go back and debate with me in the comments section, if the American fleet, if they had not done that, and the American fleet had actually steamed out to meet the Japanese fleet, let's say in a earlier battle of the Philippine Sea, Greg, I am not sure those battleships probably, we recycled most of those battleships in Pearl Harbor. Here we got a jet going by here. It's not a Japanese Zero. We were able to recycle most of those battleships at Pearl Harbor and put them back into service. Can you imagine if the full American fleet had gone into conflict with the Japanese fleet, let's say in deep water around the Philippines, and the Japanese were attacking the Philippines, and the carriers were with those strike groups? What would have happened? the Americans were not prepared for what the Japanese had come up with in those fast attack carrier groups. They had superior aircraft at that time, and the outcome and the war could have been much longer if you think about it, if the American fleet had been sunk somewhere out in in deep water in the Pacific. So what ended up happening was we were attacked at Pearl Harbor. We suffered heavy losses. So the American fleet went into a holding action in the Pacific until American production could actually produce the weapons, we could get the troops trained, and we could actually attack the Japanese. Now, what happened, and we've covered the Wildcat before, is we were up against this Zero fighter, which we've discussed, which the Zero was designed to be a bantamweight fighter, fairly not super high-speed airplane, 10 to 15,000 feet over water. It was highly maneuverable, but the Japanese sacrificed armor, self-sealing fuel tanks to get that maneuverability. But that fighter in the Pacific, that Japanese fighter in the Pacific, was arguably the best aircraft anywhere, bar none, at that time in the early war. And the Americans, all we could do, and the British and any of our allies, was essentially hold the line and try to slow the Japanese down until we could mount an effective counterattack. Now, what happened in that time frame, Greg, was the Zero was kind of a legend, and we were getting combat reports back, and also from the Flying Tigers in China, and the reports were not good. In other words, that the airplane could outroll, outclimb anything that we had in inventory, and we were having staggering losses in the air. But we eventually captured a number of these types, and we brought them back. One actually came back into North Island. I've seen pictures. Greg can throw up some of the other ones, but we eventually got some of these that were flyable. And when they flew them, the American designers, especially Grumman, as part of that, basically reverse engineered the airplane. They went back and looked at all of its strengths and weaknesses. We knew that it didn't have armor. We knew that it didn't have self-sealing fuel tanks. It had a different type of aluminum. It had larger ailerons, and it could as I said, outclimb and outroll anything we had. It could not outdive any of our airplanes. And one of the things that combat pilots early on against the Zero realized was you did a gun run against a Zero, you dove on the Zero, you broke. Once you went from the Zero, you gained speed and went back up. You did not dogfight with the Zero. That was a way, in a turning fight, that was a way of certain death. And even some of the Japanese pilots were skilled because they've been fighting in China, but some of these guys were still marginal pilots, but they had a very, very good airplane, and they were up against an untrained adversary. So that was the Zero. So they reverse engineered the Zero. Now this is a marvel of American production, Greg, a marvel of American production. And that is that this aircraft, this Hellcat, was produced from the time of the design until it started rolling off the production line in 1 year, if you can believe that. And they started going out to the fleet. Now this aircraft, there were a little over 12,000 of these produced. To show you what a game changer it was in the Pacific, the Hellcat accounted for 75% of all American aircraft victories in the Pacific. Greg, can you believe that? That is astonishing to me. It accounted for 5,200 enemy aircraft shot down. That is probably a number that will never be equaled. I don't know that we will ever see, and if we do, can you imagine the aerial combat that will be going on to best that? So over 5,000 aircraft shot down. It was an exceptional fighter. Now let's get into it, shall we? Oh, and Greg, I want to thank you for bringing my cranky Hellcat back. This airplane needs some Visine. I don't know if you can see that, but he has definitely been on a bender. So Hellcat, wider stance than the Wildcat, bigger wing, higher visibility, still kept gone up to the 650 caliber machine guns. It could outclimb the Wildcat. It could outturn the Wildcat. It had self-sealing fuel tanks, and it had armor. Now, when it went up against the Zeros, and Greg, there are a lot of accounts of Zero pilots mistaking early on Hellcats for Wildcats. And what the Zero fighters would do is a lot of the Zero pilots had a tried and true method. You get an Allied fighter into a dogfight, and he'd get on your tail, and the Zero would go into a zoom climb. What happens when you go into a zoom climb against a Wildcat with a Zero? The Wildcat stalls. It could not climb with the Zero. We already knew that. So the Zero would come up over the top and come back around. Now, if you're in a rolling fight with it is, again, incredibly hot in this hangar, Greg. We're in another warm day. If you're in a turning fight and your aircraft stalls, well, first of all, if you're at low altitude, most likely you're dead. You're going to just spin into the ground. The airplane will never recover. If you have altitude and basically your aircraft is out of control, the Zero would come up over the top and make the kill. There's a couple of really good accounts of Zero pilots trying to pull that maneuver with a Wildcat, and guess what happened? They're in that climb, and who's directly behind him? That Hellcat. The Hellcat would follow him up into the climb and make the kill. One of the things you have to remember that in the nose of this airplane was a new engine too, that R2800. That was a new, more powerful radial engine. Remember, radials worked well in the Pacific, and so most of the aircraft out in the Pacific, any of the carrier airplanes were radial aircraft. But that R2800 was a major, major difference between the Wildcat behind that big three-bladed prop. That wasn't to say that the Hellcat was invincible, but at the time, it was head and shoulders above the Zero. Now, at the Battle of Midway, Greg, what happened? We caught the Japanese at Midway. Another advantage we had is we broke the Japanese code. We basically ambushed the Japanese carrier battle groups, and most of the experienced Japanese pilots and the carriers that attacked Pearl Harbor went to the bottom of the ocean. The Japanese, with this aircraft coupled with the Essex-class attack carrier, these fast attacks groups under Halsey that raged all over the Pacific, coupled with the fact that Yamamoto said, "I've awoken a sleeping giant, and I can guarantee you," and I'm paraphrasing here, 6 months of victories, but I can't guarantee anything after that, because he actually went to school in the United States. He told the Japanese High Command that he could not hold the line once American production came into play. This airplane is exactly the type of thing that he didn't know about this airplane, but this is exactly the type of surprise. And the ships, we talked about in another segment, 155 aircraft carriers. The Japanese never accounted for the fact of American production. So they were gradually just essentially overwhelmed. This airplane is exactly what Yamamoto was concerned about, and ultimately he was proven right tactically in that these fast American carrier groups basically raged all over the Pacific. What ended up happening at that point was they were able to cut off the American or the Japanese supply lines, and a lot of these Japanese strong points like Rabaul and some of these other places were essentially just cut off and withered on the vine. Now, probably this aircraft's finest hour was probably the Marianas Turkey Shoot, the Battle of the Philippine Sea. The Japanese had made a decision that the Americans were not going to advance any further into the Pacific, and that is where they were going to hold the line. What ended up happening was these aircraft destroyed what was left. The Japanese carrier groups, which the Japanese carrier groups in that battle were basically used as bait to lure Halsey away, and then the Japanese used heavier surface fleet like battleships, their super battleships, and were going to try to attack the landing beach, the American landing beaches. And I'm paraphrasing all of this, but the Japanese lost what was left of their carrier force. They had a large number of aircraft that were on the ground that were going to attack the American ships that were there. They lost most of those. Now, Greg, one other thing, and this airplane played a role in this as well. What was it? What happened? We saw the first use of a kamikaze in that battle against one of the CVEs, one of the aircraft the light Jeep carriers of the American force that was covering the beaches and American landing beaches, and it went to the bottom quite quickly. It was a scary portent. Interesting word, portent. It was a scary portent of things to come as the American fleet moved further inland. What ended up, or moved further into the Pacific. Now, what ended up happening was the Hellcat essentially destroyed Japanese air power, both carrier-based and land-based. And then, Greg, they ran into something pretty frightening. And that was, we saw that kamikaze attack early on as the Americans got closer, especially at the Battle of Okinawa. American fighter aircraft, primarily Corsairs and Hellcats, provided what's called a CAP, a combat air patrol, coupled with the American advantages in radar. Radar had come up, but the Japanese were launching wave after wave of kamikaze attacks. The American Navy at Okinawa lost more surface ships in the Battle of Okinawa than they lost in the entire previous fight in the war. And that was because these Hellcats and Corsairs were up against something different, Greg, and that was what was essentially the world's first guided missiles. Sadly, they were human guided bombs, but these Hellcats were then in a desperate fight because what were they doing? They're defending their carriers. And you could see, Greg can throw up some of the images of Bunker Hill or the Franklin being hit, or some of those battleships being hit by these kamikazes. But this was a very, very difficult fight. But this airplane was the predominant airplane at that time. It made it interesting out of World War II, Greg, all the way out until 1960. It was retired in 1960. They used it as target drones. Greg can throw up some target drones. Interesting thing about this particular airplane moving on is that in airshow circuit, a lot of airplanes, like we talked about, the Bearcat and the Tiger Cat, these aircraft, considering that they had a little bit longer life, didn't show up in aficionado hands as much. There's a number of these aircraft showing up in aficionado hands, but I would be remiss, I'd be totally remiss, Greg, totally remiss, if I didn't salute the Hellcat pilots that saved the American fleet and fought so long ago. And one of those guys, and Greg can throw up his image, is Ken Martz. Ken Martz is a Hellcat pilot. His picture is actually in our hangar. He's one of our docents. Remember, I talk about the museum all the time, that we have every one of these airplanes is tied back to an individual that was fought in the war, and the history. The airframe is one thing, and flying them as pretty airplanes at air shows is one thing, but having them actually tie back to individual people is another. So all of you Hellcat pilots that fought it out during the war and really saved the American fleet, and probably ended the war earlier because of Japanese losses, I salute you. Oh, by the way, I'm moving through this a little quicker today, Greg. This bottle is somewhat nondescript. It is a Boylan bottling. It is an orange cane sugar, established 1891. It does have a sell-by date, Greg. Sell-by date. The sell-by date here is February of 2022. So my burning question is, what is in this stuff that it can sit on a shelf for 2 years and still be good? Do you know? I don't know. Have Poison Control on the line, Greg. Remember, Boylan is not a sponsor of our program, and we're going to give this a shot. It is pure cane sugar. You know, I haven't had orange soda in a long time. Greg, this is really good. I am not putting this baby down, Greg. I'm keeping this one with me. Boylan, you scored a hit here. So there's one thing, an interesting thing I want to talk about, and that is we're going to have a Fred fun fact. Remember, Greg, I promised you kind of a little known fact here. Here's a factoid. I blew your mind. I liked that little thing you put on the last video where the mind was blown. I'm going to blow your mind again. So Genda was one of the planners, the Japanese naval officers that planned the attack on Pearl Harbor. He, interestingly enough, was the Japanese and the Germans for some reason, and I don't really understand this, and maybe somebody in the comments section, I'm going to take another swig of this thing. I'm going to drink all this before we're done, Craig. This may be the first 35-minute Warbird Wednesday as I run out the clock on this to finish this, but Genda planned Pearl Harbor. The Japanese and the Germans consolidated all of their good pilots into these hunter-killer units. Essentially, they put all their good pilots into one unit. He was no different in that at the end of the war, he consolidated into a unit called the 343 or the 343rd Air Group. They fought in Japan and they used an airplane. We don't sometimes, we talked about the Zero. Zero is a great airplane. We don't give the Japanese, and I've given credit to the Germans before with like we talked about with the Bearcat, the TA-152, and of course the ME-262. We don't give the Japanese enough credit. They turned out very good airplanes at the end of the war. The challenge was they didn't have the resources and they didn't have the production capacity to turn them out in any numbers that we're going to think this airplane I talked about. There were like 1,200, 1,300 of them made, but they didn't turn them out. But Genda, at the end of the war, ended up in this 343rd Air Group, and he was flying the Kawanishi N1K. Now, the N1K was, I'm going to move this over so I don't drop this Hellcat here. The N1K, or the interesting thing, the variant was called they always had interesting names for their airplanes, Greg. It was called the Violet Lightning, which is an interesting name for the airplane. The N1K was on par with the P-51, the Corsair, or the Hellcat, what we're talking about here. It could actually outturn any of those airplanes because it had an interesting, this is, by the way, a Fred fun fact, it had an interesting flap situation in it to drop the flap so it could turn at low speeds. It had a mercury switch in there. So, Greg, we should go out and throw up how a mercury switch works. For the kids at home, you can figure out, but it had an automatic flap switch that it could turn extremely tight, and it was on par with Allied fighters of the day. Now, the interesting thing about it was there are action reports, combat reports that are verified that when this aircraft came up against Corsairs and Hellcats and Mustangs, and this is kind of scary if you think about it for the Americans, the kill ratios were equal. In other words, the Americans would lose as many as the Japanese. Remember, in this airplane, we had a massive kill ratio, but when we ran into these experienced pilots and Allied fighters, or against Allied fighters, the tables would turn. Now, Genda went on. He was in the Japanese military. He was actually in the Japanese parliament, and if I'm right, Greg, this is also weird. He died 40 years to the day of the Japanese surrender of World War II, to the day. That was Genda. You can look him up. He was a very interesting guy, but he flew one of those hunter-killer groups. Now, if you want to amaze your friends and be the talk of parties, Greg, this is it right here. This Hellcat shirt is our gratuitous product placement. You can go out to the website and pick that up. It has a beautiful shot of that aircraft flying, the F6F Hellcat. It is in a wonderful color. It will, as we say, it will make you 15 miles an hour faster. It will regrow your hair on your head, and it will make you the talk of parties as everyone wants one of those Hellcat shirts. Greg, is anything that I just said, well, maybe everyone might want one of the Hellcat shirts, but the rest of it is a product disclaimer. I am clearly over-exaggerating. But you want to get out to the website and get yourself one of those shirts. So this is the sum up on probably one of the, I'm going to put this down, Greg, as much as I hate to part with that nice little sweet soda there. This is the sum up on that F4F Hellcat, the Lion of the, I like that. I just tied it together. I didn't even mean to do that, Greg. The Lion of the Pacific, one of the top cats. It was a game changer. So I want to thank all of those Hellcat pilots that saved the American fleet and no doubt shorten the war. Also, go out to our YouTube channel, smash that subscribe button, like us on Facebook. Remember, in order to restore these airplanes, we can always use your donations. My name is Fred Bell, the Vice Chairman of the Palm Springs Air Museum. Thank you so much, and have a great day.